Barber, and we're looking at crime and punishment. Today we're going to be looking at how effective law enforcement was between 1700 to 1900. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you should be able to understand the shift towards the prevention of crime, describe the emergence of the Bow Street Runners, and be able to explain the developments in policing. Firstly, we're going to have a little bit of a look at what law enforcement was like up to this period. So we're going to start off with the Anglo-Saxons. For hundreds of years, policing had been the responsibility of the local community. The Anglo-Saxons had the tithing. This was 100, which was split into 10 groups of 10 men each, all over the age of 12. They would self-police each other to make sure that none of the others in the group committed a crime. There was also in this period the hue and cry, where if someone saw somebody else committing a crime, they would raise the hue and cry. All within the community would then have to chase the criminal and try to catch them. If someone didn't help, then they would be fined. They also had the shire reeve in each community, and he had the role of trying to prevent crime, particularly cattle theft. The whole community during this time was responsible for tracking down those suspected of crimes. So, crime prevention under the Normans. So some things stayed the same, such as the tithing and the hue and cry. However, during the Norman period there were some changes. For example, there was a shift towards government control. To ensure that the forest laws were kept, William employed foresters who would catch poachers. Under Henry II, courts were reorganised and prisons were set up to hold people until they went on trial. This was from the Assize of Clarendon. He also had justices of the eye to visit each county twice a year to try the most serious cases, again meaning more centralised control. Standard written instructions were given to local sheriffs to make the system fairer across the country, again increasing government control. Richard I introduced coroners to deal with the suspicious deaths, and then appointed some knights to keep the king's peace in unruly areas. And later in 1327, Edward III extended this to all areas, and by 1361 these became known as Justices of the Peace, and these met quarterly to carry out the magistrates' duties and enforce the law. As landowners, they were particularly harsh on poachers. These were all now appointed by a central authority of the king. So, change in continuity between 1500 to 1700. Continuity. Much was similar, with communities mainly responsible, but in towns they were less effective due to the rising population. However, witnesses to crimes were still to stop suspects or report them. They also still had the hue and cry. There were also some changes. For example, the role of the town constable and night watch grew, but standards varied. As a result of the varying standards, some rich people started using thief-takers, including the famous Jonathan Wild, to find stolen property. However, some of these were corrupt. So, let's start on law enforcement between 1700 and 1900. Again, there were some areas of continuity. In the early 18th century, so that's the 1700s, the law continued to be enforced using a combination of methods previously used. These included parish constables, who still dealt with the local disorderly behaviour, petty criminals and beggars. They also still used watchmen, who were organised by the parish constable, and these were responsible for protecting private property. Part-time soldiers were used to deal with rebellions or riots, and some towns now had salaried constables and watchmen, so this could be considered the start of the modern police force. These were responsible for undertaking foot patrols in order to prevent crime and arrest suspects. However, this position was low paid and had a low status. There were also the worry by some that the watchmen and the constables were close to the criminals, which meant that they thought that law enforcement could be impacted. A key change during this period, however, was the formation of the Bow Street Runners. The Fielding brothers believed that rising crime was a result of the breakdown of order as thousands flocked to London to make a living. They also blamed the bad example set by corrupt politicians. As a result, they set up a crime fighting team in 1748 in London. It was initially the work of Henry Fielding, who was the chief magistrate. His offices were in Bow Street, hence the name. At the start, there were a small team of volunteers who attended crime scenes and detected criminals. He thought that thief-takers, who had been formed before, should form a part of law enforcement. However, due to the corruption associated with them, he also recognised that they would need reforming as well as being monitored. He believed that if this happened, it would help to improve not only their effectiveness, but also their reputation. So he appointed thief-takers as principal officers, and these became known as the Bow Street Runners. There was also the Covent Garden Journal, which was called Hue and Cry. This is where they published information about criminals, crimes and stolen goods. Magistrates and jailers from all over the country passed on the details, which created a national network of information. In 1754, 6 years later, Henry's brother John Fielding took over the running of the Bow Street Runners. Initially, the Fielding brothers charged fees for their service, and they collected rewards from the victims of crime if there was a successful conviction. However, by 1785, less than 40 years after it was set up, they were officially paid by the government, so they could be classified as the country's first modern detective force. Now, the Bow Street Runners were significant in their innovative approach. They aimed to deter criminals by increasing the chances of them being caught and successfully prosecuted. They also organised regular foot and horse patrols by paid constables along major roads. This was really significant in helping to stop highway robbery, as they could now be caught by the horse patrols. They understood also the importance of collecting and sharing information about crime and suspects with other law enforcers. As a result of the work of the Fielding brothers, their Bow Street office became a hub for crime intelligence network. In 1792, there was also the Middlesex Justices Act. As a direct consequence of the success of the Bow Street Runners, more detective officers were set up in Middlesex and in Westminster. In 1792, the Middlesex Justices Act set up more offices. Each one had 6 constables who were tasked to detect and arrest suspects. There was, at this time, a mix of part-time constables, watchmen and Bow Street Runners, so law enforcement by the 1800s still wasn't unified. This meant that there was not sufficient resources to deal properly with law and order. At this time, despite many people trying to encourage a police force, there was still a lot of opposition. This was due to the following reasons. Firstly, some people were worried about their personal freedoms and their privacy being violated. Some people also doubted that it would really make a difference to law and order, while other opponents considered a consolidated and bigger police force too expensive to be funded. So, by 1829, we have London's first professional police force. This was the creation of the Home Secretary Robert Peel. The 1829 Metropolitan Police Act replaced the system of watchmen and parish constables. This led to the first professional police force being established in London and was a huge change. The new Metropolitan Police Force had 3,200 uniformed men and opened the way for further changes across the country. 17 districts across London each had its own police division with 4 inspectors and 144 constables. The emphasis was on deterring criminals by having a public presence on the street, with constables patrolling their beats to counter crime and to catch any criminals who were caught in the act. This new force had much greater numbers than the Bow Street Runners and was better organised. Also, they were given their own uniform, which looked civilian rather than military, and officers remained unarmed to distinguish it from the army. This was to help reduce the public fear that the police might be used to limit their freedoms. So a little bit more about Robert Peel, who was the Home Secretary. He was the Home Secretary in 1822, and he was really keen to ensure that the police force was seen in a positive light. He also had a lot to do with reform of prisons. He wanted to improve the lives of people by reducing the amount of crime. He used statistics to paint a picture of rising criminality. At this time, there was widespread belief that crime, especially violent crime, was on the increase. The crime rate had risen sharply following the French wars, when unemployment had been a problem. He was very persuasive and reassured fellow politicians that a police force was no threat to freedom. Despite Peel's attempt to make the new police force acceptable to the public, there was still a significant public concern that they could be used to prevent political protest or to put down opposition to the government. During this period, the government was becoming more involved in people's lives. The war with France between 1803 and 1814 forced the government to raise money through taxes. Local authorities were also, at this point, given powers to raise their own taxes, which they could use to pay for a police force. After the French Revolution, governments and landowners feared something similar might happen in Britain, with the monarchy being overthrown. Due to high food prices and high unemployment, there were many large-scale protests after 1815 and the Revolution, and to many it seemed a real possibility. This had helped people to think that constables and watchmen were inadequate. This helped lead to the development of the professional police force. So, how the police force developed between 1829 to 56. Despite these changes in London, improvements in policing outside London were slow. So by the mid-19th century there were still big differences between regions in the country. Some areas had professional police forces, whilst many still relied on the old system of parish constables. The reason that the pace was slower was because the public was concerned about the potential cost involved. There was also no cooperation between areas. Development was also optional rather than enforceable by central government. So many local government organisations simply didn't bother with the reform. The Municipal Corporations Act gave borough councils the power to set up a local police force. However, the impact of this was limited, as only 93 out of 171 had done so by 1837. In 1839, there was also the Rural Constabulary Act. This act allowed the 54 counties to organise a paid police force in their areas. JPs were given powers to appoint chief constables and employ one police constable per 1,000 population. However, the success of this was only limited, for by 1850, 11 years later, only 36 counties had done this. At this time, the Bow Street Runners and other forces in London merged with the Metropolitan Police. Scotland Yard and the Detective Branch in 1842. In 1842, the Metropolitan Police set up the first regular detective branch at Scotland Yard with 16 officers. Their role was to gather evidence, investigate and solve crimes after they had been committed. Instead of patrolling the beat in uniform, they focused on investigating crimes and wore ordinary plain clothes. Their activities were viewed by some with suspicion and accusations that they were no better than spies. There was also the 1856 Police Act. This 1856 Police Act forced the entire country to set up local police forces. This was the start of the modern police force. By this time, the police were regarded with respect and not suspicion by the public. This meant that all areas now had to be and provide a professional police force that was centrally controlled. All police forces were now inspected by government officials and only received government financial grants if they were delivering their police services efficiently. The Act also established the principle of deterrence through detection of criminal. The idea that criminals would be less likely to commit crimes if they knew that police officers were actively looking for them. In 1869, the first national crime records were set up. This saw the use of technology in policing. Telegraph communications meant that different police forces could communicate quickly and effectively to share information about crime and suspects. And in 1870, police helmets were introduced. In 1878, the Criminal Investigation Bureau Department was set up, the CID. This employed 200 detectives, and a further 600 were added in 1883. The CID developed new methods of detecting, and in the 1880s they tried to identify Jack the Ripper by his handwriting. In 1902 they secured the conviction of a burglar using fingerprint evidence for the first time at the crime scene. And by 1884 there were over 39,000 police in Britain and over 200 separate forces. So, when you're looking at revision, you need to think about what stayed the same, for example, the hue and cry in villages, the parish constable and their role, which went from before 1500 to the start of the 1700s. Then you need to think about the changes, for example, the formation of the Bow Street Runners, the use of mounted horse patrols, the Metropolitan Act, the start of Scotland Yard, the 1792 Middlesex Justices Act, the Municipal Corporations Act, and the Royal Constabulary Act, the Police Act, the establishment of crime records, and the CID. So overall, this period saw a huge time of change. You also need to think about key people, such as the Fielding brothers and Robert Peel. Think about the shift towards detection rather than just deterrence, which was crucial. Think about the limitations that there were still, such as the lack of technology and the lack of fast transport. And also think about the initial hostility to the police and the reasons for this, and how it was overcome. So, exam questions. You could be asked to explain one way that policing was similar in the early 1700s to the 1500s. You could be asked to explain why policing improved between 1700 and 1900. You could be asked to explain why there was opposition to more organised police force. Would you be able to answer them? So, for example, explain how law enforcement was similar between the early modern period and the Middle Ages. I could answer it something like this. Between the early modern period and the Middle Ages, one similarity in law enforcement was how they policed crime. The use of the hue and cry, a system for catching a criminal which relied heavily on the community, as they were required to drop what they were doing and partake in finding the person that committed the crime, was used widely in the medieval period, and this continued into the early modern period. However, it was only used in smaller communities such as small towns and villages. You need to think about things when you're writing. What is good about this answer? What could be improved? And could you actually make those improvements yourself? Another question that you might be asked is, law enforcement in this time was very effective. How far do you agree with this statement? You need to again start with an introduction highlighting that some aspects were effective whilst others weren't. Each time you start a paragraph, you start with a key sentence, which is your topic sentence. This gives you the theme and the judgment. So, for example, you could say law enforcement at this time was very, somewhat, or not very effective because. Then you'd need to give your evidence for this, which is your factual content. Then you'd need to say one reason for this is, and then follow up with a second reason. Each time you give some evidence, you need to explain how it relates back to the question, and then end with a concluding sentence. So, for example, therefore it is clear that law enforcement is, or was, because. Paragraphs 2 and 3 you repeat with the same structure, but make sure that you provide balance. So if you start off with saying it was very effective, you then need to make sure that at least one of the other paragraphs gives examples of how it wasn't as effective. Then you need to make sure that in the conclusion you round up with a final judgment.